Oh,
You're going to
whoops.
start the recording, right?
Well, we just accidentally did. So, let's go ahead and
Welcome to the first webinar of the fall 2018 semester. My name is Dr. John Barnshaw. I'm the Associate Vice President for Research and Statistics at Astra Information Systems. Joining me today on our webinar for Astra Academy is Dr. Nathan Grawe, who is the Ada M. Harrison Distinguished Teaching Professor of the Social Sciences and a Professor of Economics at Carleton College. Previously, Nathan served as Dean, or as Associate Dean, from 2009 to 2012 at Carleton College. Today's webinar is entitled Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education, which also is the title of Nathan's most recent book, which he's going to share some of the insights from today. The overview for our presentation will be a brief introduction by me, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nathan for about 35 to 40 minutes, where he's going to discuss some of the key insights that he'd like to share with you about his book, Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education. At the conclusion of his presentation, we've saved some time for comments, questions, and a brief survey about your experience on this webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit of information about Astra Information Systems. Astra is a course scheduling and enrollment management organization, and we partner with over 600 institutions annually to improve the course schedule and efficiency, usually by working with institutions to find a way to graduate more students faster. Our most recent report, which is released last week, will focus very much on this topic. This Astra Academy webinar series brings together diverse stakeholders in higher education to focus on one central issue, which is how can we find a way to graduate more students faster. And many of the topics, like the one discussed here today, will involve issues around student retention, time to completion, or graduation. So with that, I'd like to give a brief plug to Nathan's book. We will provide a copy of this webinar prior to tomorrow. It'll be on our website. And if you're listening today, there will be a recording of this webinar on our website for Astra Academy, as well as we will send it to you via email, as well as a copy of Nathan's presentation. The recording will be available to you as well. Nathan's book was published by Hopkins University Press, and the link is actually embedded in this today. I had an opportunity to read the book, and it is an excellent book and one of the most thought-provoking of the year because it touches upon an issue that many of us are focused in higher education, and that is what can we expect or what insights might be gleaned from future cohorts in assessing the demand. Well, Nathan has created a higher education demand index, which relies on the educational longitudinal study and has provided a lot of other insights, which he's going to share with you now. So with that, I will turn it over to Nathan. Nathan?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to all of you for joining me this afternoon. The topic here is really about how demographic change is going to shape the future of higher education, and I'm sure most of you are aware from media reports about a number of factors. One has to do with migration. So people have been moving from the northeast portion and to some degree the west coast toward the south and the southwest. This is looking at migration patterns of children ages 2 to 17, so focusing on our future demand pool. We also see reports like this about the birth rates and how the number of births to minority groups is higher than that for whites, and that's shifting the composition of demographic groups. But more recently, we've seen some more challenging headlines. I'm sorry, before we talk about that, these shifts have in in headcounts have led some people to headlines like this one from the Chronicle talking about minority applicants to colleges will rise significantly by 2020. The basic argument is that if there are more minority young people, that means there have to be more minority college graduates. John McGee, in his book Breakpoint, put it, bienvenido al futuro de los Estados Unidos. So, here's the future of the U.S. and the future for higher education. More recently, we've seen a more disturbing pattern. Here we see the fertility rate per 1,000 women in 2007. That was peak fertility for the United States. For the United States as a whole, we had fertility that exceeded that necessary to replace the population just with births without requiring any immigration. And that replacement rate is approximately 2,100 babies per 1,000 women. You need one baby to replace each woman, one to replace a paired male, and then a little bit more for the fact that some women don't have children and some kids die. You can see here that the blue states are all meeting replacement rate fertility, and the light orange states are pretty close to that replacement rate. But even in 2007, at the peak of fertility for the country, the Northeast was not producing babies in large enough numbers to replace. As we jump forward, however, when the financial crisis hit in 2008, we saw that people responded to that economic uncertainty by decreasing their fertility. And so over the course of about 3 years, the total fertility rate, the number of kids that each woman would have over the course of her lifetime if she followed the patterns that were being observed across age at any point in time, that total fertility rate fell by about 10% in just 3 years. And then while the economy recovered, fertility rates haven't recovered. They've continued to edge downward. And at this point, we're looking at a fertility rate that's about 15% lower than the 2007 peak. And so if we revisit that state map, what we see is that almost no states are producing birth rates that are high enough to replace the population. When you look at this map here, the darkest red is a new category. It's states that are producing they're producing less than 80% of the replacement rate. So they're 20% shy of what's necessary to maintain a stable population size without immigration. And when we in higher education think about what that means for us, we're sort of advantaged in the sense that we can foresee what's going to happen about 18 years ahead. Babies that are born today become our students in about 18 years because kids age about 1 year at a time. We can use this information, hopefully, to think about what we're likely to see in the mid-2020s and beyond. We'll note that the fertility drop happened across all racial groups. So here's looking at that total fertility rate. We can see the drop that happens in the mid-2020s as a result of the financial crisis. We see that the drop was especially steep among Hispanics, but it hit all racial subgroups. And if you look then at forecasts of the number of high school graduates, these are the WICHE data that people generally see, you see these patterns that maybe some of you are becoming increasingly aware of. We see an increasing number of high school graduates predicted until that birth dearth hits us in the mid-2020s. And if we look at it across states, we see that not every state experiences this equally. And in particular, in the northeast quadrant of the country, we see a lot of decline, and then a bit out on the West Coast as well. And the question that my research posed was, in essence, what does this mean for me? I saw this WICHE data in an earlier form as part of a strategic planning exercise. And one of the things that I noted was that it wasn't clear to me that this WICHE data really was sufficient to inform institutional decision-making on our campus, because my campus just serves a niche community. And in fact, all of us do. When we think about this WICHE data that focuses on the number of high school graduates, or if we look at population data from the Census Bureau, these numbers are the same whether we are sitting on a campus that's a two-year college or an Ivy League college. How can it be that the Ivy League data and the two-year college data are the same? And so that was the beginning of my question. How can I do better than this headcount data? Are the headcounts really the right way to think about the future demand for higher education? Or is there something that we could do to improve upon those forecasts so that we could account for the fact that not all kids are equally likely to go to college, and to account for the fact that some kids are more likely to go to a two-year college and other kids are more likely to go to a four-year college, and so on. Now we know that there is this variation in college going because we can see it in all sorts of dimensions. So here's looking at college going rates. These calculations are from the 2002 Education Longitudinal Study. Just recently, we've got a new high school longitudinal study of 2009, so I'll be updating these figures shortly. But in the 2002 Education Longitudinal Study, we can see the share of students who go on to any post-secondary institution or four-year institution and so on. And what we see is that kids in the Northeast are more likely to go to school. This is increasingly so as you look at more selective forms of education. So by the time you're looking at institutions ranked among the top 50 colleges or the top 50 universities, there's an 11-fold difference between the West South Central, where Texas is, and New England. These are enormous differences in probabilities, and we start to get the sense that, well, maybe just counting up the number of heads in the room and treating all kids as equally relevant to all institutions isn't the best way to go. We also see differences by race and ethnicity. So we see, for instance, that Asian Americans have an incredibly high attachment to, in particular, selective four-year forms of higher education. We also see that African Americans and Hispanics have lagged the other racial groups in their propensity to attend colleges. And so again, treating students all as one might not be the best way to proceed. Here we see college attendance rates by the maximum parent education. And we see that if a student has a model of a bachelor's degree, they're much more likely to go to college, much more likely to go to a four-year institution in particular. And again, we see that these differences become stronger, especially in the selective forms. So just to see how all of these can combine, let's think about what is admittedly a cherry-picked case, but it's not as cherry-picked as I could have made it. So we've got two hypothetical individuals. Person A is an Asian American woman living in Boston with both parents. Each parent holds a bachelor's degree. The family earns $125,000. Person B, an Hispanic young man living in rural California with his mother. She holds no degree and earns $40,000. The probabilities that these two kids are going to go to four-year colleges are vastly different. Person A is 10 times more likely to attend a four-year college or university. And if we look at institutions that are ranked among the top 50 colleges or universities, then we see that the difference is more like 35-fold. So treating these two individuals as just two people and they equally count in our forecast for the future seems to be really suspect. And no matter what kind of institution we are, we might want to do better by accounting for these differences in the probability of attendance. So what I did in my book in just a basic heuristic is to think, well, there are different subgroups. So here I have the greens and the blues, and there are 6 blues and there are 4 greens in this example. But if the probability of attendance among the blues is only 1/6 and all of the greens are going to go to school, we see that the college going population is really predominantly made up of greens. So what I do in the model is to look at the changing demographic characteristics of existing kids who are between the ages of 0 and 17 and so observable, and I can then predict for each one of them, given their demographic characteristics, what's the probability that they're going to college. And I can see how that probability might change over time because of changes in demographic markers. And so, for instance, what if the blue population is increasing by 17%? Well, then the picture changes slightly, but we still have a predominantly green population in the college-going class. To give a slightly different and more complicated version of the story, we can see in the dark gray arrows, I'm sorry, the light gray arrows, the backbone of the model. If a 3-year-old is observed in state A in the American Community Survey, which is what I use for my population statistics, at some point in time, then we can anticipate that in 15 years, that student will be age 18 and perhaps still living in state A. Now, reality is a little bit more complicated than that. We lose a few students, thankfully only a few to mortality. Much more importantly, students move from one state or metropolitan area to another. We have immigration that adds kids to the system. And we have changes in family structure, and family structure is an important predictor of college going. So the model is a little bit more complicated than simply those light gray bars, but the basic observation is let's look where kids are and then project where they're going to be by the time they hit college going age. And for each kid, let's assign a probability that they'll attend college, that they'll attend a 4-year college or a 2-year college or an elite 4-year college and so on. And then we'll forecast a number for the number of kids who are going to attend colleges of different types. I should say right now that The project that I'm proposing here is actually a little bit simpler than the problems that most demographers grapple with. So demographers will often be wrestling with questions like, how many babies will be born next year? Well, that's a tricky question because it is based on behaviors that haven't happened yet. So to underscore again, I'm looking at kids who are already born. So I was looking at the 2011 American Community Survey, and if a kid is age 17 in 2011, I'm just observing that they're going to be 18 in 2012 and so on. So with the 2011 American Community Survey, I was able to project out 18 years to the class that enters college if they enter on time in 2029. So let's look a little bit at what happens to the projections for college demand for institutions of different types if we use this probability weighted approach. And first we'll look at two-year institutions. So here's the forecasted change in the number of students who are potentially attending two-year institutions in between 2012 and 2029. And at this point I want to underscore that these forecasts are more projections than predictions. We can certainly hope for changes in behaviors on the part of individuals or changes in policies at our institutions. We'll talk about those at the end today that would change these predictions. These aren't set in stone. I'm hoping, in fact, that after seeing how the status quo would play out if we just continue to play the same game that we have played, how that will motivate people to change. So here we're seeing for two-year institutions, if you're in the Northeast in particular, there's not a lot of reason to hope. Most institutions that are two-year institutions, as you know, if you're on one of those campuses, draw from students from a very regional market. Students are traveling often under 20 miles from their high school to their two-year institution. And so when you see that the geographic market looks like this for two-year colleges in the Northeast, there's not a lot of hope that they could say go to Colorado and recruit students. Two-year college that is located in the Mountain West obviously has a much happier picture in the next decade or so. Next, we can look at regional four-year institutions. So these regional refers to institutions that are ranked outside the top 100 colleges and outside the top 100 universities on the US News rankings lists. And if anything, this picture actually looks a little tougher than the two-year college picture and a little bit tougher than the population picture. We see again that the Northeast, almost without exception, depending on where you want to draw the line for the Northeast quadrant of the country, Minneapolis-St. Paul is the only exception to the rule in Cincinnati of dramatic declines in the number of students who have the demographic markers of attending institutions like this between 2012 and 2029. Next, we look at institutions who are ranked between 51 and 100 on those US News lists of colleges and national universities. And here we see a slightly better picture. The Northeast is still very tough, but we see potential growth in selective markets in the Southeast and in large parts of the country to the West. These schools, while still having a very regional flavor and accent based on where they're located, do draw students from throughout the country. And so they might hope, for instance, that they could shift some of the losses from their institution by recruiting students from some of these new and growing markets. And finally, we have elite four-year institutions. Here we have the institutions ranked in the top 50 colleges or the top 50 universities. A much, much happier picture. So let's talk a little bit about why is it that as we went up in selectivity, we generally saw an improvement in the picture and what that might mean. So the two driving factors are the rise in the population of Asian Americans. In the last couple of years, Asian Americans have become the fastest growing ethnic subgroup. They are the largest immigrant group. And Asian Americans, as we saw earlier, have a really strong attachment to higher education. At the same time, we also have the consequences of recent decades during which the acquisition of education increased dramatically. So if a couple decades ago we had more and more people going to college, as we look forward in time, that means more and more parents who've gone to college. And having parents who've gone to college is a great predictor of going not just to college, but to four-year colleges and selective four-year colleges at that. And so it's those two trends that lead to a picture in which we have a general upward trend in the number of students who have demographic markers that look like they're going to attend elite four-year institutions. But while there is this general upward trend, even for these elite schools, when we hit the mid-2020s, the size of that birth dearth causes a reversal. So right now, this picture is looking at from 2012 to 2029. Right now, we sit roughly where the model predicts we'll be at the end of the 2020s. So between here and the end of 2029, the model predicts that we're going to have a rise as we see this, the effects of the rising educational attainment of parents, followed by a reversal that's brought about by the birth dearth. So, institutions in these elite classes may not want to expand their student base between now and, say, mid-2020s, only to have to reverse that. That can be a very painful experience to be shifting. They may choose instead to just maintain the course. If they do that, that means that there are some kids who look like elite going students who aren't admitted to those institutions, and they might fall to national institutions. So one way through some of the demographic crisis for those national institutions is to figure out how can we identify students who are likely not to appeal to the elite institutions, the sort of the overflow. If the elites are going to experience this more sanguine picture, how can I figure out which kids have those markers of going to an elite institution and pick them off so that I can reduce or even eliminate the downward trend that I'm experiencing as a national institution. If we look at the aggregate numbers across the country, here we can see for two-year colleges through elite four-year colleges, those totals. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner that two-year colleges are predicted to have across the country as a whole, this is more or less stasis until the mid-2020s, and then they run into the front edge of that birth dearth. Remember, however, that this isn't the experience of all parts of the country. The Northeast has been experiencing low birth rates for a long time now, so their student numbers have been trending downward. So if you're in the Northeast and you're a two-year college, the model's predictions are more like a gentle decline, as we just have persistent declines in numbers through the mid-2020s, and then we hit the birth dearth and it turns into a not so gentle decline. Whereas if you're looking in the Mountain West, you would see a steady increase until the mid-2020s when there's a reversal. As we move from the two-year colleges in the upper left toward the elite colleges and universities in the lower right, you can see that we again see those sort of persistent upward trends as the educated parents are more likely to aspire to more selective forms of education for their kids. But even the elite institutions can't offset they can't ignore the birth dearth that's coming. We can also ask the model to look at what we might expect for the distribution of students at different institutions along a number of dimensions. So here we're looking at race ethnicity distributions. And if you look at the left two columns, you're looking at projections for the number of 18-year-olds. So this is basically looking at what's the distribution of kids who are going to turn 18 in the 2029 school year. And you can see the stories that you've read in the newspaper are true in the Chronicle of Higher Education. We see a more diverse population coming toward us with a rise in the number of Hispanic students and Asian Americans in particular. As we go from the leftmost columns to the rightmost columns, we're moving to two-year and then four-year and more selective forms of four-year education. And we can see that all institution types across the country should expect to see the diversification along race ethnicity lines. But while there is that commonality, there's an interesting difference if you stare at it a little bit more closely and look at which subgroups are increasing. As we move from the two-year colleges and the regional four-year colleges toward the elites, you start to see that diversification looks more about a rise of Asian American students and less about Hispanic students. So if you're at a regional institution ranked outside the top 100 colleges and universities, diversity is coming and it's probably going to look more Hispanic. For the elite institutions, they too are going to see a more diverse student pool. In fact, you can see that the share of white students with those demographic markers of attending elite institutions, the share of white students is dropping even faster, but that's driven more by an increase in the share of students like that are Asian American. Now again, it's not clear whether the shift in our pools necessarily translates into the shift in our students. Our admissions offices get to decide who they admit to some degree. The Department of Justice and Harvard are having an interesting discussion right now about just how much choice admissions offices have in this regard. When we see the rise of Asian Americans in the representation of students who have markers of going to an elite school, will that actually turn into Asian Americans attending those schools, or will those schools lean against that shift because Asian Americans' attachment to higher education is so strong? That remains to be seen. It brings some interesting things. If higher education, elite higher education, continues to lean against the numbers of Asian Americans, then when we said that national schools might look for which students aren't being admitted to elite schools but have the demographic markers of elite attendance, well, it might look a little bit more Asian American than is represented here. We can do the same kind of analysis with parental education. This is one of the more surprising things that comes out of the analysis. And so we see the 18-year-olds again on the left, and then different institutional types as you move to the right. The big observation here is that the share of students who come with parents who have a bachelor's degree is likely to increase, and the share of students who come with no parental model of a bachelor's degree is likely to decrease. This often runs afoul of a lot of headlines that seem to suggest we should expect more and more first-generation students. I think what we're forgetting is that in recent years, we had more and more first-generation students, which means we have more and more parents today who are educated. It's harder and harder to find adults today, adults of childbearing age, or adults of 15 to 20-year-olds who don't have an experience with college education. And as that becomes harder to find, that means we're going to have fewer and fewer traditionally defined first-generation students. If you look across the spectrum, you actually see that trend toward more parental educational experience is predicted to be stronger at the more elite forms of education, and it's not going to be as pronounced at the two-year colleges. One note I would have here is that we have to be careful in our definitions. What does it mean to be a first-generation student? Well, if you literally mean, does your parent have a bachelor's degree, that might become less common. But what does it mean to have a parental experience with the higher education system? If you look back in the 1960s and what did it mean to go to higher education, it's a very different answer than what it was in the 2000s or in the 2010s. You might have kids who say, yeah, my parents got a bachelor's degree, but they didn't have a residential experience, or they did some of their work online, or they hopped around from one institution to another. And so while the student has a parental model of a bachelor's degree, they may still need the kinds of supports that we have traditionally associated with first-generation students. So while the model predicts that there will be fewer literal first-generation students, I don't want to necessarily conclude that that means that we can shift our focus in terms of providing services to help students succeed. And finally, we can look at the geographic distribution of students attending different institution types. And here, what I would point out is that with the exception of the Midwest, which maybe you can see visually here is contracting. With that exception, the changes are relatively modest. It's not as if you went onto an institution that drew students from across the country and walked across the quad. You're all of a sudden going to hear that everyone's speaking with a Southern drawl, or that you see a very, very different student body. These will be more subtle changes when it comes to geography. The bigger story here is not so much about the shifts around the country, but the birth dearth that's going to be causing declining birth rates across all regions of the country. So we can see that we're going to see different students coming. Part of this is just due to these persistent trends of migration and immigration and differential fertility rates across race and ethnicity. We're going to be teaching different kinds of students. And on top of that, we've compounded those challenges with the birth dearth that hit in 2008. How might higher education respond to the forecasted changes that I've presented here? Well, the first thing that we might do is expand recruitment. For example, we might reduce enrollment differences by race and or income. We might recruit differently, or maybe there's public policy that will shift things, and we might hope to recruit our way out of this demographic challenge. I think this is the most common approach that people first think of. If I see that there aren't going to be as many students, I turn to my admissions department, I speak here as a faculty member, and I say, boy, you got a lot of work to do. I hope you figure it out, because I don't want my paycheck cut. So please go market better. Surely, addressing these enrollment gaps is important. It's important because it serves our mission. It's important because industry needs students who are highly trained to serve in the employment opportunities that we have. This is all true, but I think we need to be honest about whether it's realistic to think that simply expanded recruitment is going to get us through a fertility drop of 15% when that birth dearth hits us in the mid-2020s. I'm reminded of this book by Daniel Brown called Under a Flaming Sky. He's telling the story of the firestorm that hit northern Minnesota in 1894. There'd been a lot of lumbering work done up there, and because of the speed of it, they just cut off the limbs and let them lie where they fell. That meant in a dry summer that they had an incredible amount of fuel that was just waiting for a wildfire. The firestorm that hit, however, was not just any old wildfire. Firestorms are wildfires that get so big that they create their own weather. Imagine tornadoes of flame. You've got entire trees that are being lifted by the powerful winds and hurled miles ahead of the fire line. In just 4 hours, 400 square miles went up in flame during this firestorm. There's an interesting story in the book about the difficulty of the human brain of comprehending paradigm shift. There was a train in Hinckley when the fire hit the town. It didn't even have a chance to turn around, but thankfully it saved many of the townspeople from Hinckley running full steam up the line on an unscheduled run backwards, laying on its whistle the entire way, hoping that the people of Sandstone would come to the platform to see what the to-do was about. And the people of Sandstone did come out, because that was indeed odd. And their neighbors just down the road from Hinckley were hanging out of the train windows, gasping for air. Their clothes were burned off of them. The evidence of something calamitous was right in front of the faces of the people from Sandstone. And the people from Hinckley were saying, get on the train. This is a wildfire like we've never seen. And most of the people of Sandstone turned around and said, I'm going to go back to my farm and take care of it. I've dealt with wildfire in the past. And Brown points out that psychologists have taught us that this desire to see patterns, to say, I've seen this before and I know what to do, is actually a really great asset in our brains. That is how we get through life effectively. We get a little dopamine hit every time we do something that's been successful, and that trains us, hey, do this again. Except when there's a paradigm shift. When the environment shifts fundamentally around us, we have a desire to say, oh, I've seen this before. In the case of higher education, I raised this story because turning to our admissions department and saying as a faculty member, well, I sure hope you do well and recruit some more students, I'm sure it'll all turn out, may not be sufficient. We can actually ask the model, what if we had a dramatically different relationship between, say, race and ethnicity and college attendance? What if we went into the probability model that's estimated behind my forecasts, and you cut in half the differences between Asian Americans and all other racial groups? That is to say, you make all racial groups look more like Asian Americans in terms of their college attendance. This would be an enormous change. This would be a shift that causes, instead of 40% of people getting college degrees, 50% get college degrees. And yet, and we do the same thing by income. So, and yet if you look at regional 4-year attendance, you can see that if we were to have the effects of income, or if we were to have the effects of race ethnicity, while it would help, it still wouldn't dramatically alter the national picture. The reduction in the number of kids that's coming down the pike is so severe that simply telling your admissions department or your public policy makers to enact policies that expand college attendance rates probably isn't sufficient. We have to think about other solutions. And so I don't want to suggest that we can't work our way through this mess with some involvement of the admissions office, but I do want to suggest that maybe we need to think more broadly than that. That said, I think there is something worth talking about here in terms of diversity. The dominant narrative that I hear is that there's a trade-off in the admissions process. You can have diversity, or you can have net fee income. Diversity is going to cost you. I think in the current environment, there are two other narratives we need to consider. One is, with an increasingly diverse prospective student pool, failure to reach and retain diverse students is just going to compound our problems. So given the problem that we face, we better look at all solutions, and certainly figuring out how to reach a diverse student body is one important part of the solution. And second, I read, this is not my area of specialty, but those who study Generation Z argue that more recent students who are coming down the pipeline to us really value diversity. And if institutions don't adopt policies to attract students that look like the United States, those students might be lost as well. So Diversity surely is going to be a part of the solution. Recruiting new student groups, part of the solution, but probably we're going to need more than that. So what else might we do? Well, we might change recruitment activities to target growth areas. Now that's not possible for all institutions, depending on where your school is located and what markets you can potentially tap into. There might not be any growth areas in your region. But if you think about elite institutions, say in the Northeast, I don't suspect that they're going to have any real calamitous change. They're going to change where they find students, and they're going to shift toward the West. That means places like Carleton, where I'm at, where we have drawn students from the West, are going to face some increased competition from those institutions. I think we can sadly predict that there's going to be additional pressure on public funding. If you're at a public institution, you know that public funding for higher education was cut during the Great Recession. When the Great Recession hit, families had lower budgets. That meant lower tax payments. That meant that state legislatures had lower budgets. And it seems that they looked around and they said, well, we don't like delivering the bad news. So where are there things that we fund that have alternative revenue streams? And they found higher education. And so simultaneously, they are berating higher education institutions for raising fees while cutting allocations. Well, the last couple of years have been a little bit better. We still aren't anywhere near where we were. So when you look in the 1990s, families might have been expected to pay about one quarter of their college education at a public institution. By the 2000s, we're looking at it being 1/3. By the time we get through the Great Recession, it's now about half of the educational tab that families are being expected to pick up. So why do I suggest that it might actually get worse? So this is looking at research by an expert named McGinnis, who points out that, hey, Medicaid funding is going to become a problem. With Medicaid projections showing that states are going to face higher and higher medical bills that they have to pay. State legislatures are not going to be flush in the near term, and they'll probably turn to higher education yet again. If we have fewer students, I think that puts the faculty at a less advantageous position. And in particular, if we're expecting to see in some institution types a rise followed by a precipitous fall, I can imagine why administrators would want to have additional flexibility. And that means they might rely even more on adjunct professors. So I don't say this with any joy or excitement. I think it's just a reality that we're going to be having to think about. The next bullet point, I want to note that I am not being paid by Astra, and I'm not trying to push any particular solution, but increased attention to retention. This is one of those points that I wish I'd made more of in the book. And then after talking to people, when the book came out, I realized, oh, I sort of missed the boat on this. The cheapest student for you to recruit may become students who are already on your campus. I know we have all paid attention to retention in the past, but when you have every year more students available in your prospective pool than you had the previous year, there are certain actions which might increase retention that you simply look at as too expensive or too much work. But when that environment changes and you no longer have a student to replace the one that you lost, it has a way of focusing the attention. Many institutions have such low retention rates that they could effectively offset the losses that I'm projecting here by simply finding a way to retain and graduate more of their students. And if they did this, it would be a tremendous win-win-win. Obviously, it would be a win for the students. No student starts out on an educational adventure with the expectation of dropping out. It would be a win for the institution's bottom line. Some of the financial pressures that I'm worried about following from these demographic changes would just go away if we could have students continue to enroll because they continue to see the value of their higher education. And finally, it would be a win for society because we would be better fulfilling our missions. We would have a more effective workforce that was ready to work. So increased attention to retention is one of the most optimistic changes that I can foresee here. If we can figure out how to retain more students, then we don't have to recruit as many students. Increased international student recruitment. My focus is entirely on the domestic market. Obviously, if we don't have domestic students, maybe we can find international students. However, whether we are going to be permitted to draw more international students is a political question. Obviously, it's a question that's being asked. In 2015-16, we saw a drop in the number of new international students, both at the graduate and the undergraduate level. So I'll be curious to see what the numbers say in the years since 2015-16. But certainly, it appears that there's a little bit of reason for nervousness if we're putting too much weight on the expectation that we are going to simply recruit more students by looking abroad. The final thing I would say is, in thinking about recruiting students, I think all of us, all institutions in their own way, and it's going to play out in a lot of different ways, need to be thinking about our own unique institutional mission. Who are we, and what might what is the value added? And that's because the alternative is that we cease to be useful, and that's more painful. So to see what closures and consolidations might look like, I don't know if this constitutes a closure of a sort, but it's a shift. We're seeing more and more of these headlines. So Wisconsin-Stevens Point plans to eliminate 13 majors. The 13 majors weren't just in the languages, though. It was English and political science and sociology. They were choosing to shift their resource focus from these traditional liberal arts focused programs toward more pre-professional programs. So I would say, as a faculty member at a liberal arts institution, this breaks my heart in a lot of ways, but I will give the institutions who are making these hard choices credit for at least taking seriously the fact that we need to meet market demands, that there are, they have to figure out who they are, and they're having to live out that mission. I personally think that there are many institutions for whom that liberal arts mission that apparently Wisconsin-Stevens Point and to some degree Montana have chosen to walk away from. I think there are many institutions who need to recognize that, hey, at our heart, we are a liberal arts institution. I think about DePauw University, for instance, recently announced a gold commitment, a program whereby they promise all of their graduates will either have employment or graduate school admission when they graduate, or they'll provide them an entry-level position or a free term of DePauw education. They're leaning into their liberal arts identity. But whether you're shifting toward or away the liberal arts, whether we emphasize or de-emphasize pre-professional programs, I think it is fair to say, if we want to succeed, we may, in times of scarcity, need to focus a little bit more on what is our identity, what is our mission, and make sure that we are making choices that align really sharply with that. So in closing, a change to watch. If we think about the attendance rates, we've seen something really interesting and optimistic in Hispanic enrollment. So the solid black line, not the thick one, which is the national average, but the thinner one, for Hispanics has been increasing pretty consistently since 2000. And we've seen a recent little surge so that the attendance rate among Hispanic students is now equal that of the nation as a whole. So where Hispanics have been lagging, they have now caught up and closed the gap. Now, sadly, the attendance rate among African Americans has opened up a bit, so not all of the news is optimistic. But obviously, if we continue to see this kind of surge closing gaps with the Hispanic community, that's a large, fast-growing minority population, that may help offset some of the changes that are being projected by the model. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at updating these forecasts right now using the 2009 high school longitudinal study and also the more recent Census Bureau data on just population counts. And what I'm hoping to see is that when we do the forecast with the new data, because of this surge in the Hispanic attendance rates, we might see a bit of a softening, though probably not a reversal, of the overarching story. So with that, I think I'm going to open it up to conversation and questions, and I thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Nathan, and this was excellent. So thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was outstanding, and I'd just like to let you know that we will be taking your questions, and I have a few already. So if you see in the chat message, you can see @Astra Organizer, that is me. You can feel free to actually send that along. The other thing I did want to make you aware of is that we will be doing a poll on this webinar to get your feedback and get some of your feedback, as well as to let you know about a few upcoming webinars. We actually have another webinar scheduled at 3 p.m. Eastern in 7 days from now on September 18th, where Robert Kelchin will be presenting. Robert is an assistant professor at Seton Hall University, and he has a book entitled Higher Education Accountability. And then in a couple weeks after that, on October 3rd, I will be presenting an Astra special report, which is focused on graduating more students faster. And then we will also have our own conference, which is scheduled October 14th through the 17th. So there's a few dates in the near future that you'll want to be aware of. So feel free to send your questions along. I'll begin by asking you a question about, we'll start right here with Hispanics and Latinos. Nathan, you mentioned that they are the fastest growing group and that they have actually caught up to essentially the national average, it looks like here. In terms of that, is that growing predominantly in the Southwest, or is it all over the U.S.? And what implications might that be for institutions that are in areas where they're seeing a declining enrollment? Have you talked to any institutions that are kind of reaching out to Latinos and Hispanic students to actually recruit them in areas where there's wide gaps, like say, for instance, in your area of the country in the Midwest?
Yes, I don't know the answer geographically. I did look because I was curious. Okay, so this is a post-secondary enrollment rate, so you'd be coded as attending college if you went to a 2-year college or a 4-year college. And so I looked to see whether the surge seemed to be predominantly at 2-year institutions where Hispanics are disproportionately likely to attend, or if it was across the board. And I was encouraged to see it was across the board. I've seen some research done by others that's pointed out that one of the things that many of us in this line of research forget is that immigrant populations mature. And so the vision that we might have in our heads about, well, what does an Hispanic population look like? We might think, for instance, well, it's disproportionately first generation, that is people who arrived here as immigrants themselves, with a little bit of second generation. And we are distinctly moving with the Hispanic population in the United States toward, well, no, I mean, it's a second generation. Yeah, there are some first generation people, to be sure, there always are, but the kids of the first generation are now the parents, and we have a third generation of students that are becoming our potential demanders. And that's just a reminder that, you know, the immigrant communities are assimilating, and they're starting to make choices that look more like the choices of the groups that have been here slightly longer. So, you know, it's encouraging to me to see that it's not just that there's an increase in the 2-year college attendance rate. It appears to be in the 4-year as well. I think certainly it will help the Southwest disproportionately because they have a disproportionate share of Hispanics. But I have also heard institutions in the Northeast, for instance, recognizing that they too have an important subpopulation that is Hispanic students. And if they're going to meet their missions of preparing their populations for future workforce needs, they need to be reaching those populations as well. And so I know institutions in the Northeast are attending to this every bit as much as students in the Southwest.
Yeah, that will be certainly something interesting to follow in the future, because the definition of a minority serving institution as it relates to Hispanic serving institutions is a percentage of your population under the federal reporting. So that will be interesting to follow. One question about this visualization. Someone would like to know, is the enrollment rate between the enrollment rate among Asian students between 2005 and 2010, is that saying that 90% or 9 out of 10 Asian Americans are going to college?
9 out of 10 Asian Americans who graduate from high school will attend some post-secondary institution the fall following that date. So it doesn't mean that they'll persist, though Asian Americans tend to persist at higher rates. I mean, it's absurd, the rates there, the wiggle there that you see in the early 2000s. I just can't believe that, you know, that there was a big drop in the attendance rate among Asian Americans sounds really suspect to me. So I'm not sure I believe that, but the storyline being that, wow, Asian Americans have always had a really high attachment, and that it's amazingly increased at about a rate that's similar to that of other groups, despite starting from such a high point. Yeah, that's what it's saying.
Yeah. Someone else wanted to know about, in terms of clarification, I thought I heard Dr. Grawe say that diversity is an investment for the long term. I think what they want to know is, when you were talking a couple minutes ago, do you view that if an institution was going to invest in their diversity initiatives, that that could pay off economic dividends later? So if they have a track record of recruiting but also retaining minority students, or diverse students, I guess is the question wanted to know. Is there a long-term investment play there for diversity beyond just the short term?
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is that argument feels like it might be stronger at this point in time than the past. I don't, the question of whether that investment is a good investment or not obviously depends on a lot of other factors at the institutional level. But so often we have viewed diversity through this lens of, well, it'll cost you. And I don't want to say that that isn't partly true. It is true that minority families have less income on average than white families, and so they can bring less to the table in terms of net fee income. And so to some degree, that's still with us. That, well, if you give up this white student, white non-Hispanic, in favor of this Hispanic kid, but it's not clear to me that in this time where we have this declining number of prospective students, that we really are necessarily making the choice either or. Both and might be both possible and really, really important. While the Hispanic family might not bring as much to the table in net fee income, if they're able to bring more than their additional costs of educating that student, well, every little bit helps. And I think what the questioner is raising is another good point, which is, if you look into the future and you say by 2030, we may need to rely more on minority students, I'm not sure that you want to wait till 2030 to try to appeal to those students. You might have an easier time appealing to them if you have a track record of figuring out what they need and how you can create a welcoming environment today. So it's not so much that I know that it is a good investment, but just that I think there are reasons to, if in the past your institution has looked at it and said, diversification in this direction or that direction just feels too expensive, well, it may be shifting. That the answer to that question might be shifting. And so maybe you want to revisit the question.
Got it. One institution, or a representative from one institution, I assume they're in enrollment management, says that we have been offsetting our losses of 18-year-olds through our veteran population. Does your book talk about any details related to veterans? So I think they wanted to know, I don't recall, did you mention veterans? Or veterans is certainly a group that many institutions of higher education have increasingly targeted and sought to recruit in terms of maybe offsetting some of the demographic change.
Yeah, the answer is no. And more broadly, not just veterans, but non-traditional students are another market you might want to tap into.
Sure.
Certainly in the 1980s, when we saw that there were fewer babies born in Generation X than in the baby boomer generation, expanding into non-traditional student markets was part of the way that we saw an increase in enrollment rather than a decrease. The reason why I didn't look at that is because, frankly, the data that I have don't let me. The longitudinal studies that the Department of Education has paid for stop tracking the cohorts. Basically, I can look at their behaviors in the traditional college-going activities, and I think it's one place where we, as an industry, might want to lobby the government and say, look, yes, higher education choices of young people is really interesting, and we really appreciate the work that you've put into that. But rather than retiring the education longitudinal study right when those kids get to become non-traditional consumers and starting up a new cohort of the high school and longitudinal study, maybe you could invest those resources in extending the longitudinal study a little bit longer so that we can see, what do these kids do when they are no longer kids? They turn into 30-year-olds and even young 40-year-olds. That behavior, I don't know that we have as strong data on as we really need, given how important it is for especially two-year colleges.
Sure, thank you. In terms of another question is, our institution is out of the top 100. I think they were referring to earlier I think you made reference to the U.S. News America's Best Colleges. But do you have any strategies to help improve our recruitment out of our region. So I think they're probably a regional public or an ASCU type institution. What strategies, and maybe this is from your own experience working in an institution such as this?
Yeah, so so at Carleton, I'm at one of the lucky few, ranked in the top 50 of national liberal arts colleges. But I have talked with folks who are working at the much larger number of institutions, which are the regional schools. The typical student doesn't travel that far, as you all who are at those institutions know, from their high school, say, to their college. If they're at an institution that's not ranked in the top 100, they're typically not traveling, but say even 100 miles. That does make it kind of challenging, because that means that you don't have a very large number of submarkets that you can look at. And if all the submarkets within 100 miles, say, of your institution are contracting, then it's not entirely clear that you can opt out of that. I think some institutions are trying to use online technology. So I talked to one that in particular went online to serve non-traditional students. So they offer a service to employers as sort of an HR benefit, that if you work with this company, you can take classes at our institution type deal. And interestingly, they found that in some, so they're in the Northeast, but they serve some companies in the South. In some submarkets where they had made major inroads with non-traditional students who were getting this employment benefit, they saw an uptick in the number of traditional students who were applying to their institution from that submarket. And so what they interestingly were doing was two things. One is, by using the internet, they can teach people who are geographically distant. Of course, there's a lot of competition here. But secondly, by reaching the parents, they were increasing their brand recognition geographically. So now, the 18-year-old daughter or son of this adult is like, oh yeah, I know that institution. I might apply to go and attend there residentially. So I think there are some interesting things being done to use the internet to try to break those geographic barriers down. But the bottom line remains that if you look at those regional institutions, the national numbers are down. So if you think you have found a way to thread the needle, you have to recognize that you are definitely bucking the national trend. And so then the question is, do I really believe that I have found that that strategy? It depends on how risky it is. What if we don't succeed? If we embark on this strategy, what's the fallback plan? I would want to at least consider that, because the national numbers are just so down, and everybody's going to be looking for whatever up markets there are.
One quick question related to the university mission and workforce development. Did you say DePaul, the University in Chicago, DEPAU?
No, thank you.
Yeah.
The W in Indiana, in Greencastle,
Okay.
Indiana.
Got it. Okay, thank you for
Gold
that.
commitment. Yep.
And one of the questions was about social mobility, and I think the work about Raj Chetty, I think they wanted to know about in terms of. So your research has talked about this. Have you noticed any kind of demographic changes looking at data from some time ago? I know they used similar data to look at the mobility of students and that kind of thing. Was there anything in terms of the demographic change from maybe the most recent educational longitudinal survey, which you're just starting to get into, versus the other one? Did you notice any differences there?
I haven't. No, the HSLS, the 2009 longitudinal study, only just a couple months ago released the first data on college going. So I think we don't yet know the answer to that question.
Okay, great. And the final question I think we have time for is related to undermatching. I think earlier in the presentation, I think this respondent is asking about what about undermatching? So maybe I guess that was earlier in the presentation, you were talking about how maybe an institution has historically not reached out to a different group of students or that kind of thing. Undermatching is obviously a problem for those of you that might not know. It's when an institution, the student has the ability, whether it be GPA or ACT, SAT scores, to get into a university, and they choose not to apply or that kind of thing. What the question might be, what can institutions do about undermatching as it relates to demographics?
Yeah, so I'd first note that Yeah, so undermatching is accounted for in my methodology just in the sense that insofar as it happened in the observations from the education longitudinal study, whatever rate it was happening at, my projections say, well, what if that rate of undermatching continues to occur? So it's built into those probability estimates. In terms of solving the problem, yeah, that's a trickier deal, in part because I'm not always sure. There are a number of reasons for undermatching. Some of them are, I guess, legitimate, for lack of a better word. There are all sorts of family reasons or cultural reasons why a student might attend a nearby institution, even though you say, "Gosh, you could have gone to a much better institution." So it becomes kind of tricky.
I
I
think
don't
that's a
really
fair
know
question
what to say.
in 1 or 2 minutes, Nathan. I mean, people have written books on that topic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do thank you all very much for your attendance at this webinar. This has been great. I hope you will join us next week at 3 p.m. Eastern Time when Robert Kelchin joins us for Higher Education Accountability. But thank you all for attending, and thank you, Nathan, so much for presenting. I
Thank you for having
included the link to the book in the chat, so I hope you will take a look at it and order it through Johns Hopkins University Press. Thank you very much for your attendance today.